I have lived long enough to know that opportunities must be seized or they will be lost.
Welcome back to Wall Street Radio. It's the 21st of February, 2025. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the Celsius Alani Nu acquisition, as well as trucking and infrastructure, teasing a new article coming out next week on the potential impacts Trump will have on the infrastructure in the United States and kind of where the investment opportunities might land with that. Nvidia earnings next week, what that could mean for the sector as a whole, and also a little bit of a touch on Elon Musk and his continuation within the government and Grok 3, the new XAI product that just released, and kind of how it stacks up against its peers. Enjoy.
Right on. Where do you want to start today?
Well, I think for me personally, I'd like to start with Celsius, because Celsius is a business that I've been involved with since 2020, when it first started to catch some steam on Twitter and really with the FinTwit community, headed by Jonah Lumpton, our absolute favorite. But for what it's worth, he did bring it to the FinTwit audience, and it's a good company. Celsius energy drinks. I've personally used them. I try to stay away from caffeine, so just, it's not something I'm on a daily use for, but man, do I have a ton of friends that use their products, whether it be the packets, like the caffeine packets, or just the actual cans themselves. It's kind of taken a significant amount of market share over the last few years from Red Bull, Monster, because the clean branding, I think, just from a eye-catching perspective, people like that. The nice white cans, simple designs, not too busy or kind of crazy as far as like what they actually look like and like their branding and campaign strategy. So from that perspective, people like it. And then also they have a big health focus. Now, I say that, and more recently they had like a class action against them for something that was wrong. But I think it's fair to assume, and maybe you'll agree with me on this, if you own a food and beverage company, it's fair that somebody is going to sue you at some point or another. I mean, you even look back at some of the titans, Chipotle, back in 2017 had a health class action lawsuit against them, and that was a whole issue for a few months and kind of blew over, and now everything's fine again. So, but yeah, in any case, they are buying out Alani Nu, which is another competing kind of health focused brand. I think from a brand alignment perspective, it's a great buyout. They're both kind of in that same health focus, but also caffeine and energy drink space. And both of them are not right at the top of the energy drink market. They're kind of in the middle. I believe Celsius placed third and Alani Nu is fourth. So they're not going after one of the big dogs or one of the smaller dogs. They're kind of going after somebody that's right in their wheelhouse as far as total market share over the food and beverage industry, or over the energy drink industry. So I think it's a fair acquisition. We had talked about on previous podcasts how we think mergers and acquisitions are going to ramp up, and we're seeing that now. So yeah, I mean, let's talk about it.
Yeah, I like the acquisition. It's interesting. Celsius as a brand followed a little bit of the Red Bull model. I remember when I was going through school, one of the big things was the Red Bull girls. Like a lot of college girls were sponsored by Red Bull. They'd be at bars, and the Red Bull vodka would be a huge thing. One of my good friends at the time, his girlfriend was sponsored by Red Bull as like one of those Red Bull girls, and she would put on a lot of events. And essentially one of the deals we did and got was if we showed up at one of the bars called the Keg, and we brought, I think, 20 or 30 people with us, they would provide free vodka Red Bulls the entire night. And it was kind of like if you brought the party to the bar, you were going to have a good time. And Red Bull got really big for me in college when I was there around 2010 to 2014. Like that was just the main energy drink that everyone was going with. And it obviously worked well when you're pairing it with vodka and alcohol. And it was a great time. Monster was also big at that time, but Monster was a little bit more of the energy side of things from sports and motocross and the publicity they got with like live action sports and entertainment and adventure. Red Bull was this different type of energy or vibe to it. And when Celsius came on the market a couple years ago, like really heavily, it also more mimicked, in my opinion, the Red Bull brand than Monster, where it went after the Celsius girls, right? That was like a huge thing that they did, was they hired all these models to have Instagrams as a Celsius girl, and that created a lot of energy and momentum. And I've actually never had a Celsius. I also don't drink caffeine. I've had plenty of Red Bulls, but been off caffeine for like 7 or 8 years now. So I've never tasted it, but like you, I have a ton of friends, a ton of colleagues that take Celsius and drink it. And I like the acquisition because if you look at the other people on the board from a market share perspective within the brand, you have names that I know well and that you know well that aren't as legitimate, like C4, Ghost, Rain, Nos, Bang. Like these, even though they make millions of dollars, these brands are kind of eating each other alive. Alani Nu is a brand that you can take to the next level and you can fold in a little bit more realistically with the health and wellness focus. The C4s, the Ghosts, right? All of these are a little bit more influencer branding solely based on fitness and workouts. It's just, I really do like that snag for them as they look to now compete within the big three, which is going to be Red Bull, Monster, Celsius.
Yeah, and to your point about when you were younger and you were in college, for me it was different. So like I was 10 at that time. So and I was a big skier all growing up, and one of the big things was you go to the ski mountain and like your parents aren't there, they like drop you off to ski for a while, and you and your boys get like a white Monster and split it, because we were all we were in the terrain park and competing for skiing, so it was all about energy and getting hyped up, and we were at 12 years old in the lodge drinking a Monster, and that was the brand.
That's crazy. That's
like
crazy.
that was the advertising, is to action sports kids, and or I guess not necessarily kids, but all the people that we looked up to were sponsored by Monster, Rockstar. So that's what we wanted. Now going into 2020, now that I'm in college, I college for me was 2018 to 2023. With COVID, I think we saw a much bigger emergence in fitness in young people than we've ever seen before. And, fitness isn't necessarily an action sport. Nobody goes to the gym and like they're doing backflips off the bench press, and that's kind of where Monster and Rockstar's brands were aligned. So people were looking for something new that they could take to the gym and be more workout focused and quote unquote health focused, even though the majority of it is very similar ingredients wise. And that's where Celsius kind of started to dominate, is just kind of capturing that big market of emerging fitness, not only influencers, but also just customers. So yeah, I think it's a good call. I don't know much about Alani Nu, but as far as the brand alignment goes, it makes sense. Now, I had said that they're paying 12x EBITDA, and they actually have it as like some adjusted EBITDA. Honestly, a new metric that I haven't even seen before, which is interesting. But from a brand perspective, without going too deep into the financials, from a brand perspective, I think it's the right call and the right acquisition. And we'll just see. We'll have to see how that plays out. I've been an investor in Celsius before, and for quite some time. Like I said, original buys going back to 2020. Obviously, valuation got a little hot in 2023 and 2024 with the announcement of Pepsi putting them on their distribution chain. And that's honestly something to talk about and kind of segue us into our next topic about trucking and infrastructure. Beverage companies, for those of you who don't know, it's really hard to distribute a beverage company as a startup. If you're a startup beverage co, you are pretty locked to local. It's very difficult to ship. It's not something you can put in a mailer, an 8x11 mailer or whatever, and just send to your customers. Liquid is very heavy, so it means that trucking distribution is your primary source for growth of the company, just getting it in more stores. Logistically, it's a very difficult industry to penetrate. So Celsius getting on Pepsi's distribution chain was huge for the brand. I want to say Pepsi bought 8% of the company and then also put them on their distro, and that really helped the blow up. And now Alani Nu has Amazon and Target distribution. So both of which are now well tapped into together. They're tapped into all of the biggest distribution chains. Obviously, Walmart would be a huge one to get into as well. but Target, Amazon, Pepsi, I mean, that puts them in a really good position as far as just getting their product around the country and around the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. I wasn't aware of the full distribution attack and approach that they took. And with that, it does really become a clear race for the top three of Red Bull, Monster, Celsius at this point.
Yeah. And those have a huge brand, I think, that still is kept. Like action sports in the 90s and early 2000s, as far as I remember, were huge. And that is why Monster and Red Bull were able to achieve the size that they were. But, as those people age out, I mean, how many people that were skating in the 90s are still like looking for an energy solution,
Right. Yeah.
And I think that just it makes a great point about businesses either changing or getting replaced. You're going to see a younger audience. If they don't see themselves in the brands that are currently popular, they're going to find a new one or create a new one to kind of drive traffic. So I think it's a great play for them. And again, it segues us into our next segment, just kind of talking about infrastructure in the United States and where we're at. So got a new piece coming out next week. Hopefully early next week, about just the state of the union for United States infrastructure and what we think is going to be happening with Trump's plans to bolster that. In his first presidency, 2016 to 2020, constantly was talking about overhauling United States infrastructure, building new railways, new seaways, and distribution chains for manufacturing in the United States, because that's his whole thing, is bring back manufacturing in the United States. Well, if you bring back manufacturing to the United States, you need to increase the infrastructure that we have. You can't rely on an older infrastructure if you want to drastically increase production in the United States. That's how you get congestion, and that's where the problems start to arise as far as the economics of it all. So I think this piece is going to explore not only Trump's plans from his first presidency and what that might look like now that he doesn't have as much opposition. Because if you go back to 2018, when he wanted to roll out a lot of these plans, I mean, he was just in a crap storm of political headwinds. Everything he was trying to do was just getting shot down. Whereas now he's got no opposition. He's essentially free to do whatever he wants, at least for the next 2 years until the midterms. So I think it's going to be interesting to explore kind of some of the opportunities there. I think heavy manufacturing is going to be a great opportunity. And then you also have to think, who's going to build all this? So, your Caterpillar type businesses are going to be in rotation, but then also what logistics companies are going to benefit from a better infrastructure, not only commercially, but also for consumers. So, do we get a high-speed rail? Does that increase productivity in certain metro areas? What companies would benefit greater from better travel times for their employees? So it's a huge idea to flesh out, but we're going to try and hit as much of it as we can in that article coming up next week.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited for it. As soon as you started talking and pulling at the thread of this idea last podcast, I've thought about it a ton. I'm sure the people who listen have started to think about it as well. One thing that continues to push this to the front of my mind, and really a realistic thing to think about, is because think about the themes that we've discussed heavily in the last 3 to 4 months after knowing that Trump was president: AI, quantum, space. These are all futuristic things that push us well into the future of the unknown. We have been talking about high-speed rails and fast transportation outside of planes for a very long time in the US. This seems like something that could get a ton of momentum mixed in with the idea of bringing business and bringing industry back to the United States. I mean, this, sometimes we talk about winner ideas and concepts and some never pan out, but whether or not this plays out, it's still a highly intriguing opportunity and speculative ad that could be a potential winning investment. And so you're taking a lot of the pressure on for building out this idea and what it looks like much more than I am at this point. But it's been, for me, as kind of a listener and reader, as you've been talking to me about your idea, it's exciting for me just to see how this will develop, because I do believe with all of these focuses of the economy lately on speculative futuristic things, this is kind of the perfect mold and a little bit more realistic. And for a guy like Elon, who a couple years back was really pushing for underground trains and expediting highways underground and even transportation underground at high speeds. Like this seems like it's all molding into something that even if it doesn't become real, it could still be hyped up in the market as an investment, just like all these space type programs and rocket labs and all the things that are starting to actually become something, but they're still looking at valuations that are well above and beyond what they're actually worth. You know, when the market runs hot on an idea and a belief and a dream, and it gets touched a little bit that it could be reality by the president, that's when explosions happen in the market. So I'm following closely. I mean, I'm excited to talk to you about it more, but this is something that has big potential.
Yeah, and you think about the relationship between Trump and Elon as well. Elon's got the Tesla semi truck coming out. Is there a possibility that that grid starts to expand? We start to get more charging stations across the United States and rolling out maybe a deal between the big logistics companies and Elon Musk's semi truck. So there's a ton of opportunity. What I like most about it too is the fact that while it is a speculative idea, everything that's involved, they're very mature businesses. And it's not like we're buying, like with space, for example, like my Rocket Lab buys, you know, they were coming out of, $3, $4 range, couple $1 billion valuation, not a whole lot done, 50 launches at that point in time, very new technology, very new idea. And, like we said, a lot of speculation. Whereas this idea, infrastructure is not new. This is something that we have seen in the past, not only domestically, but also internationally as well. You look back at the New Deal, you look back at the interstate system, all of this, or both of those plans from our history led to a large run in economic growth and kind of prosperity for the nation. So if we get something like that again with a big infrastructure overhaul, it just kind of lends way again into this golden era that Trump talks about and what that could look like.
And so I'm curious to get your ideas with all this in play and a lot of speculation about the adding to the economy through these industrial type moves and really surplus, right? The idea of surplus that Trump and Elon are trying to bring while also cost cutting, which we've talked about a number of times. But even recently, we've seen a lot of cost cutting happening, and it's now hitting companies like Palantir, for example, where we're seeing federal budget decreases. You know,
Yeah.
talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that was a little bit of a curveball for me. I'm going to be honest. I was anticipating Trump to be leaning heavy into these more speculative areas like space in support of Elon and into defense and development of AI through Palantir, he's a huge AI player. And to see him talk about cutting costs for these areas, and then obviously the reactions to the stocks, that took me for a bit of a surprise. Part of me wants to believe that it's just kind of like a headline type thing, and we're not really sure what's going to happen. But the other part of me is like, okay, I get it. We're cutting costs. Is his goal to slow down the economy before some kind of big run? Like, is he trying to slow us down for a couple of years, build up a base, and then build from there? Or is that just a headline and, that'll pass and the funding will continue to the areas that the people that are around him are closest related to? I'm not entirely sure what it's going to look like. Again, it caught me for a bit of a surprise. I was expecting those affected markets to continue to be fine, even though he was cutting tons of costs. Maybe he's realizing that where he's cutting costs, it's not actually as deep as he thought it was going to be. And he's like, oh shit, if we're going to continue to save money, we're going to have to cut from some of the areas that I support, which maybe was a mistake on his part. Not entirely sure. But in any case, it was a bummer to see, to be honest, because all we talk about on this podcast is the future and the sectors that are going to do well and the industries that are closest related to him and how they're going to be impacted by his spending on all of them. And to see him kind of slow down on that so early on in his presidency is like, I don't know, it's a bit of a curveball.
Yeah, well, I think he's just prefacing for what's going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
This is always a known thing that the idea of what he needs to get done or what he believes he needs to do is contrary to commercial success. right? Restricting and cutting budgets so that we can be more profitable as a country and reduce our debt, that's going to get passed down to the commercials and the corporate sector, which means that they're not going to earn as much revenue, which means shareholders will be impacted, which means different things will be stalled, right? Speculation will become less attractive. You're going to want to invest more into the utilities, the safeties, the defenses, because you know that there's a little bit more legitimacy to those businesses and less exaggeration on the PEs.
Yeah.
So it's like it's always been a thing. I think we've forgot about it in the loopiness of the market the past couple of months because we've seen such momentum with names of speculation like quantum and all of these things that have just been running crazy like space. We're probably, and we've always been, still a number of years out from those type of developments becoming sustainable businesses, just like we were when we got hit heavy with the electric car wave of Nikola, which just went bankrupt, and right, like all these other things. We were too early. Usually, the market's too early on speculation, and then in the next 5 to 10 years, the real businesses start to stand out and become something of real notice. Right, I'm actually seeing that right now with a couple of different companies that were growth stocks in 2021 that had really big peaks, fell completely down to zero, and now they're starting to make their way back up to be legitimate businesses. I kind of expect that from space and from things like quantum, where what's going to happen is we're going to see a little bit more of a shooting star type scenario. They peak, they decline, they level out a little bit more of like a realistic price frame. And then over the next course of 3 to 5 years, as the industry becomes a little bit more regulated and understood, it'll start to climb again. But what Trump is doing by, he's pretty much letting people know in advance the sky isn't falling, right? But at the same time, it could be dreams of grandeur a little bit right now in the market and setting realistic expectations. It's an interesting play. I'll say that because we've seen a little bit of uncertainty and warning in the market recently. I'm working on an article right now about the 2025 housing crisis that I'm seeing, that a lot of others are seeing, and starting to dive that out. So, like, we're just really in an interesting position right now across the entire board. And all of this to be said, one thing that hit the news this week as well is the possibility that tariffs could replace the income tax. There was also mention that the earnings or the savings that the Doge department does, it was something like they're going to mail every American $5,000.
5,000, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ideas coming out. Obviously, Elon doesn't have the permissions to do that. I mean, that would go through much more legitimate courts and the actual the actual government, which Elon, believe it or not, is not really a part of. Um, so it's interesting. There's so many different moving factors right now, and it's hard staying on top of them. One thing I did want to talk about today, because Nvidia has earnings coming up, and this is one of those things that saw a ton of success. It kind of blends into that COVID type of success and growth and parabolic, like really trajectory that hasn't slowed down. Like it saw a little bit of a pullback and decline, but that was more consolidation and cooling than anything, because the growing and really the growth of the company and their earnings has actually been well represented by the price that they've done. And so now that they have earnings coming up, like, you have been focused in semis for a while. How are you seeing their business? How do you think they look going into earnings? Like, what's the upside? What's the risk?
Well, they've been consolidating for almost a year now. So I think price has given ample time for value to catch up. Like we see in any stock that's really running hard or any business that's doing really well, is you always have price leading the value. So price is always trying to price in future value of what's going on within the company. And usually that leads to large overshoots in valuation where, and this happens on both sides, by the way. You have, when things are going wrong, price usually front runs how bad it is. And then there's a surprise that changes the tune. And in the same thing on the upside, you have price leading the growth, and then eventually you have value kind of either catch up and it continues higher, or you have people realize that there's a disparity between value and price, and then you get a sell off. We just saw that with ANF. Both of us were under the impression that ANF was doing a lot better than they were. Then they came out and reiterated their earnings, and it was a nothing burger, and it was not very exciting at all. We had expected much stronger sales going into the end of the year than what they had talked about on their pre-announcement, quote unquote. So for Nvidia, I think the price has given ample time for value to catch up. Now it's just a question of, is there still that spend from the big players that are buying H100s for AI development, or has that kind of slowed down in light of all the kind of mayhem coming out of the Trump administration? And not that mayhem is bad, but it's certainly chaos. And maybe we see a slowdown in sales of Nvidia's flagship chip, the H100, and that'll obviously have a large impact on earnings. Now, it's important to recognize as well, if Nvidia is slowing down, most of the others are also slowing down. So because they have a hero SKU, and for those of you who don't know, a hero SKU, SKU is the word I'm using. It's when a company has a product that is the majority of their sales, it's a market dominant product, and there's no, so that means there's no competition nearby. And it's the reason why their sales are going through the roof. That's a hero SKU. We've seen about 8 of them since the early 70s in the digital chip space. Most of the hero SKUs that we've seen over history have lasted about 4 to 5 years. So we're 2 years into the H100 dominance. Without a competitor, I think that dominance continues, and we'll see a continuation and rise on Nvidia there. But yeah, as far as earnings go, part of me is anticipating that there's a slowdown kind of in anticipation of everything that's going on in the Trump administration. Just companies are realizing, hey, there's so much that we don't know right now. Let's slow down on spend. But then there's that other part of me that's saying AI needs to build out if we want to remain globally competitive, and spend will continue. So we'll just have to wait and see. I'm not an owner of Nvidia. So for me, it's more of a watching than anything, but a watch party than anything. But it'll be interesting nonetheless, and it'll certainly lead the sector.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this. I mean, so it's Friday. This week in the market has been pretty interesting. I mean, it's been consolidating a bit, like slowly chipping up, but then the last 2 days have, since the announcement about the Fed cutback and the market kind of waking up to the thing that we've been talking about, which is government spending will decrease, which means commercial impact will be increased, which means, right, profitability and revenue will decrease for commercials. Like these things are going to happen. Are we walking, as I think about this, are we walking into a trap? Are like, one of the things I talk about in the housing crisis article that I'm starting to work on is this is different than 07 and 08, because during that time, there was an idea that things were a little bit too good to be true for sure, but it wasn't as known by the mass as what we're currently experiencing. Like if you walk down the street and ask someone, do you think we're in a housing crisis? They'll say yes, because the average entry price for a starter home is so significantly high. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I'll circle it back to the conversation we're having, but recently, what stimulated a lot of this thought was there was a poll recently done by the Harris Group where they evaluated, how much would it take you per year to be happy? And the answer was $285,000. And what the poll was over 4 generations. It was boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. Now, let me just read this out. For boomers, the annual income that they stated out of the 285 average was 124. Generation X, 130. Gen Z, 128. Millennials, 525. Millennials said they needed $525,000 of annual income per year to be happy. Everyone else said about roughly $125,000. And that's really wild. And what's really interesting to me is that age range, which generally is going to be people anywhere from like 28 to 43, we were teenagers, anywhere in between young teens to teenagers to young adults during the housing crisis. And what that means for a lot of us is our parents were still in the bulk of their work career. And so without going too much into the article and tying it back, if you walk down the street, people know that there's a housing crisis. They know that something's wrong because prices are still continuing to increase. You have interest rates that don't seem like they're going to come down anytime soon. you now have taxes and tariffs that will impact supply and materials. My question is this: are we one bad earnings report away, one bad one away from a really like elevator down type situation? Let's say Nvidia comes out and they miss big. Like, are we now going to start seeing the dominoes fall on a lot of these ideas where it's okay, the the federal government and the government in general is in a bit of a chaotic moment where things are getting slashed. Unemployment's going to be spiking high. We see software engineers now are getting displaced by AI left and right. Big tech companies are doing big displacements. We have a housing crisis where no one can afford new starter homes. We have a very bullish sector in chips that is now starting to decline substantially. Like, are we kind of walking into a death pit? Is that just me seeing one shade of things, or is that something that we should start looking at with investments in our, really the way we're allocating our investments, like defensively, like what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at 2022, going into 2023, when the market started to turn around, it was driven by Nvidia and spend on AI. So if you think about first one up, first one to go down, which is generally how it goes, like the early companies and sectors that really run a bull market are usually the first ones to crack when the dominoes do start to fall. So if that's the case, I think that's a fair thesis to think about of like, okay, Nvidia really led this train. If Nvidia starts to slip and the semiconductor industry starts to slip and we get large pullbacks on spend for all this stuff as the United States realizes, oh, geez, wait a minute. If we continue to push spend while interest rates remain elevated, this could really lead to a pretty quick spiral for those companies. So do those companies start to get more defensive? Maybe so. I think that's a fair thesis as well to think about of like Nvidia led this train. If they start to slide, does that just start, like you said, that domino effect where they fall, then the whole infrastructure starts to fall, and then tangential businesses start to fall, and then it goes all the way back down to the consumer. Losing jobs, not being able to afford houses, then that starts to decline for the housing market.
Yeah, when I think back to the financial crisis, it started as this domino effect where like things started falling apart. I mean, the famous Big Short
Sure.
image of Ryan Gosling hitting the Jenga tower one brick by one brick, and then it all falls down. It kind of seems like we've been pushing the pillars of like the foundational wedges of our economy just a little bit, but we've been balancing it. And ever since we came out of really COVID, we had that growth. We had 2023 was so healthy for us because it was such a nice consolidation point. And then the recent push, it just seems a little bit chaotic. And to add on all of that, just like as like one of the things I want to talk about as well is obviously the Mexican cartel recently was designated as a terrorist organization by the USD, U.S. State Department. So, what
Throw
kind of
that in.
yeah, yeah. So what kind of conflicts are we going to get from that? I mean, they should be like obviously like going after the cartel is something that we should certainly focus on. The amount of deaths in the U.S. because of laced drugs that come into the country is absolutely out of control. There was a stat at some point as like everyone knows at least one person who has passed. One hand away from one person who has passed away from fentanyl or something laced from drugs. So like all about that movement, but you kind of have this now unknown what could turn into like a guerrilla warfare type thing. So it's
Yeah.
just like you're adding a lot of different things on a sandwich. And at some point it's like, a sandwich with 3,000 toppings. It's like no longer a sandwich and you can no longer eat it. So like what is gonna happen? Right? Who
This
knows?
toppings start to slide out the sides now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
no, it's interesting we talk about this because I did have a friend, good trader, talk to me about the cartel and how that's gonna maybe impact the markets. And it brought up a great point about where we're at in the market, which is in the last 4 months, we've gotten more bad news than I think we have in the last 3 or 4 years, obviously besides COVID. Where all these little things just continue to pile up, and every time it happens you get so much noise on Twitter and other forums where it's like, this is it, this is going to be the domino that does it, and it hasn't. So while part of me recognizes that all of these dominoes are starting to align, another part of me recognizes that markets can remain irrational for quite some time. I mean, you have to imagine, I wasn't alive for it, but back in the dot-com bubble in 1997, which was halfway into that bull run from 95 to 99, people were speculating on this big pop and how the valuation of Cisco was ridiculous and the sales didn't match up with the value that it was being allotted. And for those of you who don't know, Cisco was the Nvidia of the dot-com bubble. And I make that comparison very lightly. So while part of me recognizes that the dominoes are aligning, I mean, you even throw in things like the cartel and other geopolitical tensions around the world. Another part of me recognizes that we've gobbled up all of the problems over the last few months, and the market has continued to push higher. We could do this for a long time. Like, you're a big proponent for that, which is things can remain wild with headlines and news coming out for so much longer than what we think is fair price for the market. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, of course, for sure. Yeah. Staying in the market, right? You're timing the market or it's time in market. And you have to be in the market to really at this stage in the economy and like in time of where we are, like you have to be earning market rate interest on your dollar or you're going to fall behind too quickly. And so it's really tough. I mean, that's the difficulty of this, right? It's tough to know exactly when to diversify and move into more conservative type of portfolio or when to just say, hey, like the market has been resilient lately. If I try and allocate into bonds or something that's de-risking, then I'm probably going to miss out on another 15 to 20%, right? That comes into like what your age is, what your risk appetite is, and all these things. I'm right there with you, right? Because I've seen it time and time again. I mean, that's the lesson that you learn, especially not only when you're like passively investing, but when you're actively investing in trading, you come to learn very, very quickly that the market, like you said, will stay irrational longer than you can.
Yeah, I mean, Palantir trading at 250x sales. Nice, dude.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Sure.
And we've seen that with Tesla, right? In 2019, 2020, we saw that with Tesla. And we see it all the time with these big growth companies and these big tech companies. So it's just interesting when things start piling on really quickly. And I'm also not sure if that's just a model and a mechanism of media these days and like the amount of information that we get and how quickly we get it. Obviously, I don't know if that's really changed in the last couple of years. So it's probably like on par. But with Trump coming in, knowing that he has to be aggressive in his first 24 months before the elections take place that could maybe displace his power in government, like he has to do it now, and that's probably why we're seeing more of these things waterfall down. But it's a time for a lot of people, in my opinion, to take a breather. And I actually talked to my dad about this recently, which is like understand your risk, right? That's like the biggest thing I can always, without giving financial advice. It's not advice. This is not a financial advice. It's just in general, in life, in finance, in personal relationships, and everything. Just like understand and identify your risk from time to time and what your time frame is for that risk. I think it's just highly important because a lot of people did not de-risk out of 22 going into 23. I did, right? I missed I missed the last 5 or 6 months of 2022 because I wanted to move more heavy to a cash position and rotate into bonds and just make sure that my interest that I was, secured on was a little bit more safe. And yeah, it sucks sitting on the sidelines because we continued to blast off and I missed earnings on that. But, one of the things I talked about was at that time we were, Powell was saying on a consistent basis that inflation was transitory and, there was nothing to worry about. And I was like, I don't buy it. Like, I don't see it in my day-to-day groceries. I don't see it in the housing. I don't see it in rent. I'm not seeing what you're saying. And this kind of goes back a little bit to like operating in a corporate environment. A lot of the times, what happens in corporations when they start to deteriorate is that and we wrote an article about this on Cloud, is when a business is founder led, it means the organization, and they're still small enough, the organization is flat. So the founder or CEO can still see the problems of the people and they can react because they feel the pain and they can adjust quickly. And that's kind of the same thing with government and the same thing with a lot of what we're talking about, which is when Powell was saying inflation wasn't a problem, it just meant that he wasn't being realistic. Like, it felt like he wasn't on the ground floor with all of us who was like, what are you talking about? Like, everything is getting increasingly more expensive. And that disconnect in the market, right? That disconnect with human consumer behavior, in my opinion, is what led to the setback and the cooling off in 2023, because it got to a point where people were like, this is absolutely insane. And so I think it's healthy to understand both sides of the coin, right? Simultaneously, which is, are we getting to that point like we were in 22? I don't feel the exact same way, but it feels like we're getting close. And the problem is, it feels like a lot of things have been put off, right? Like this housing crisis that we've been in for the last couple of years. When you start combining things with a lot of other like factors, it starts getting a little scary. So for me, it's all about staying invested and making sure that I'm maximizing my dollar and the purchasing power, but at the same time, making sure that I can sleep at night, and understanding my risk on a day-to-day basis right now, where there is fragility in the market and there's a new headline from Trump every minute of every day. And that's just my advice for general people, is make sure you can sleep at night.
Yeah, and it's good point of you to bring that up right now, because this podcast has probably confused more than it's assisted, in the sense that at the beginning we talked about the plans of the dreams of grandeur in infrastructure spending and kind of this big boom in AI and strength of the United States. And we've also talked about the dominoes starting to line up for a potential big fall. Understanding, like you said, both sides of those coin is so important. And I think that leaves a perfect spot to kind of end it off here. And next one, we'll get into more of the nitty gritties of either of those sides. If more news comes out, we'll talk about that. But I don't have anything else if you don't.
No, that's it. Appreciate the listen, guys.
See ya.
Now watch this drive.